Hello, everybody. Bob Oxley here. Time for tips, topics, issues, and positions. And today we're going to take a look at a topic that's in the news on a daily basis, and it's the word impeachment. We're going to take a look at what is this thing called impeachment, or as one of our guests has already indicated, it's the big I word. And then the first part, we're going to take a look at the basics, constitutional requirements, what is impeachment all about. In the second half, we're going to take a look at some of the things that are in the news concerning our President Trump and how that this term is being used around his name. So to get us started, I want to first welcome our special guest back. We have Professor Joe Green and Dr. Chip McLeod from the Political Science and History Department here at Dixie State University. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, Bob.
Here we go. Impeachment. And the reason we're doing this segment today is because I'm getting a lot of inquiries from our listeners as to what do you think about impeachment and should the president be impeached? And then I ask a few questions and I'm finding out something that's very alarming, that most people don't understand what impeachment is, what's the real meaning of impeachment, and how it is indicated in our U.S. Constitution and how it should be used and what are the parameters and things of that sort. So that's why I've asked you two experts to come on board and talk to the listeners here today about impeachment. So why don't we always start off just with the basics. So the first segment of this show today is going to be on impeachment and what is this thing called impeachment. So I'm going to turn it over to both of you. And can you kind of like start off with for our listeners, what is impeachment?
Well,
and
the basics could go on forever.
Okay.
It's I'll conceptualize, and then Joe and I will do whatever we can do. It's a combination governmental and political remedy that we inherited from our British forebears, designed to take some control over what the Constitution defines as civil officers, and we can talk about who they are and that sort of thing. A remedy for wrongdoing, and we're already into concepts that need to be defined because they're very fuzzy, even to some extent in the Constitution. And the only other thing I'll say at this juncture is the only thing we didn't inherit is that if you go through the entire process, impeachment is a thing connected to some other things, as you'll learn.
That was clear.
Well, what I mean, as we'll learn and talk about, impeachment per se is very simple, but there are other things connected to it once one has been impeached. And the only thing we did not inherit is that I'll just go ahead and throw out, if one is impeached, tried, convicted, and removed from office, the individual cannot be executed. That's old school. We didn't adopt that, but that's what folks in Europe did. So Joe will certainly want to weigh in.
The thing that to get right at the basic definition, it is not true that impeachment means, as Chip alluded to, we throw somebody out of office. Impeachment is like an indictment. It's the only thing that I can.
It's an official charge of wrongdoing of some kind.
So if you've ever watched Law and Order, maybe a lot of listeners have, the police go out and investigate, and if they think they have enough evidence to arrest somebody, then a prosecutor is brought in. They go before a judge and try to convince the judge that there's enough evidence to have a trial. And the judge then indicts, or the prosecutor brings a grand jury, and they indict somebody. That is, they bind them over for trial, and then the judge has to assign bail or whatever. Impeachment is that process for a federal, in the United States constitutional system, for a federal official, a judge, an ambassador, or the president, or a cabinet member.
It also exists at the state level as well, but we're talking about the federal level.
Okay.
Right.
But what we're saying here is that one of the misnomers out there, impeachment is just referring to the president of the United States. It's all federal.
Defined in the Constitution as, I believe the language is civil officers. And now, who is that? And we've had some interesting cases, and we can bounce back and forth. But I sort of feel compelled at this point to suggest that it was a really fun Donald Trump comment the other day when he once again made it crystal clear he's probably never read the Constitution. When he suggested rather strongly that he doubted that the courts would allow him to be impeached. With all due respect to everybody, beautifully consummate just ignorance of the Constitution. Courts have nothing to do with impeachment per se.
Wow.
The Constitution clearly defines who impeaches. That is the House of Representatives in the United States Congress. The other thing I would mention in terms of the basics is that the appropriate folks committee, what have you, in the House of Representatives must draw up at least one what we call article of impeachment. I don't know how far we'll go with this. We've had folks with as many as 11. We had folks with 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5, and that sort of thing. And what I don't think most people understand is the awesome expansiveness of impeachment. What I'm saying is that, let's make it ridiculous. I hope nobody does anything that's crazy. But if you got 218 members, that is a bare majority, and that's all that's required, in the House of Representatives to write up an article of impeachment, let's make it fun and silly, against Donald Trump because his red ties are too long, and you got 218 members of the House of Representatives to vote to level that article of impeachment against him, he has been impeached. That's the end of it.
Oh, that's the end of it.
That's the end. That's impeachment.
See, people automatically are looking at the process. They think there's a process.
No, we'll talk more about
Okay.
the Senate in the Constitution is charged with trying cases of, altogether now, impeachment. That's how that works. We've had some wacky cases of impeachment. There was a U.S. senator impeached in 1798. I'm really surprised that it took the folks over in the Senate 2 full months to realize that senators can't try senators. They dismissed it. And we have never resolved that yet because we've never had another senator impeached.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
There's a lot more to it than that. But and it's an awesome power. The only other thing I'll suggest at this juncture is that I don't think the founders meant for it to be political, but it is.
Yeah, it is. It's a remedy because Congress can't do criminal investigations and prosecutions. That's an executive branch function.
Right.
So what happens if a judge or an ambassador or the President of the United States has done something that the Congress deems to have put the nation at risk in some way? And the founders, they thought, we'll let the states impeach. They decided not to do that. The people writing the Constitution, they said, we'll let the judiciary do it. Decided not to do that. And reluctantly, in the debates in the Constitutional Convention, they decided to let the House of Representatives bring articles of impeachment, but then have the Senate convict by a 2/3 vote. And the 2/3 vote was that they were afraid it would become a political tool when Congress didn't like the president, and so they'd go in and throw out somebody who'd been elected. So the ultimate check on a president run amok is elections. That's the way it was supposed to be. But what if you get somebody who was clearly a crook, as Richard Nixon was? Okay, so and that's kind of the issue that they and the reason that they did all of this.
Well, and there are other very curious cases that, and I really hope your listeners will go look them up because they're fascinating, and they help us look more clearly. For example, the senator I was just mentioning was a senator from Tennessee. His name was William Blount, and he's the only senator to be impeached. And then once again, as I mentioned, they haven't solved this problem if you're going to do that sort of thing. But there was a Supreme Court justice impeached as well. His name was Samuel Chase. This was 1805, and what happened in his case, to give you, I think everybody would do well to take very seriously the awesome reach, the possibilities of impeachment. That's why people in Washington, once we get there to the current era, are debating this the way they are. This is no joke. This is not a minor thing at all when you go through with that. But Samuel Chase was impeached. Basically, when you look at the articles of impeachment against him, he was impeached primarily for campaigning for Federalist candidates from the bench. That was his infraction, and of course he was impeached, tried, and acquitted, and that sort of thing. There was a Timothy Pickering, if you go back to the books, impeached, tried, convicted, and removed from the federal bench serving New Hampshire early in the it was late in the 18th century, and some very interesting articles of impeachment, one of which boiled down, he was a drunk. He was actually, again, impeached, tried, convicted, and removed from the federal circuit bench. But we've never had an actual Supreme Court justice that went through the whole thing.
Wow. So in this impeachment, it is wide. We're gonna look at some specifics in the second segment today as to where we're at, because this word is being thrown around, and I'm glad you made a point that this is so serious. This is not just playing a political game with this right now.
Well, let's get to the other thing that we have to talk about, which is there are, as I recall, I believe 5 separate sections of the Constitution addressing impeachment one way or another. Impeachable offenses are, and at the same time, are not very clearly defined. Joe can certainly tell you that I'm trying to remember which article it is right offhand. But clearly definable and impeachable offenses, this is just beautiful. It's one of my favorite things that the founders did, because they were trying to do the right thing, the good thing, but they were already well apprised of what could happen. Treason, which is defined in the Constitution, bribery, which is not, we can talk about that, and also the most beautiful category you can think of, high crimes and misdemeanors. What did they leave out of that?
They did debate putting in administrative mismanagement and decided that was so broad and could be interpreted politically in such a way that they decided not to put that particular phrase in.
But instead, I don't think they improved it much with high crimes and misdemeanors. Yeah. You can wangle that and manipulate that and massage that. And if we go through what people are really interested in and know a little bit about are the presidents who have either gone through this or been threatened with it. And there are more than a couple presidents who've been threatened with it, but it didn't happen. And what became of all that sort of thing. I mean, just to toss it out quickly, the first president to be impeached, of course, was Andrew Johnson in 1868. A total of 11 articles of impeachment. And look at what people are talking about with President Trump. When you boil it down once again, primarily what Congress was after Johnson about had to do with, you get this one nice, neat category. It all boiled down to obstructing the will of Congress. And it was governmental to some extent, but it was incredibly highly partisan when it came to the politicking behind it and that sort of thing. It is not inaccurate at all, I think, to say that whatever else Johnson was doing, clearly challenging era of Reconstruction after the Civil War, and getting in Congress's way, they had a huge, complicated agenda. He wouldn't go along with it. They clearly didn't like him. They tried to impeach him once. They finally wound up doing it in 1868. And it's my all-time favorite case because they had the votes in Congress, listen carefully, to impeach Andrew Johnson before anybody had written up the first article of impeachment.
Wow.
They clearly wanted to impeach him.
Partisan politics at its
whatever
best.
else it was in part a political vendetta. So it is an awesome constitutional power.
let's take a look, just based on what you're saying. What's the difference between the impeachment process with Richard Nixon and with Bill Clinton?
Well, that's simple. I'm tired of talking. I'm just kidding. Joe could tell you more about that probably than I could, but the long and short of it is, take her away.
Yeah, Nixon had set up an illegal operation in his reelection campaign to basically spy on the Democratic National Committee and do dirty tricks and raise money illegally in order to do it. And they got caught. His people broke into the Watergate building and were caught, and gradually law enforcement was able to trace the break-in back to the campaign to reelect the president. You'll love this. CREEP. That was the name of Nixon's reelection group, CREEP.
That's right.
Okay.
Committee to reelect the president.
Reelect the president, CREEP. And it was traced to John Mitchell. And from there into the White House, into his two closest advisors, Haldeman and Ehrlichman. And his lawyer, what's his name? I'm forgetting his name now.
I'm drawing a blank as well. Whose lawyer?
Nixon's lawyer, the guy who turned on him.
It started with an M.
I know his name as well.
McCabe or...
No, that's... Okay, I'll remember it in a minute. Okay. Said that Nixon had ordered the break-in and that Nixon had ordered the cover-up. That is, he had claimed that he instructed the FBI and the FBI not to pursue an investigation which had involved former CIA and FBI agents at the committee to reelect the president. And that would be obstruction of justice if he did that. So gradually, some of your older listeners will remember there was a Senate Watergate committee. There was a special prosecutor in the Justice Department. Special prosecutor got fired. Called the Saturday Night Massacre. And John Dean. That was
John Dean.
John Dean was the lawyer, and in a Senate Watergate committee, special committee, was set up to investigate the Watergate break-in to see if the president had committed a crime. So here's the Congress now getting witnesses over, basically investigating a criminal activity, which they're not supposed to do, okay? But there was bipartisan support to do it, so Congress does what it wants. And Nixon, it was learned in those hearings that Nixon was taping all of his conversations in the White House. And so the special prosecutor asked for the tapes. That's the reason he got fired. Eventually, the new special prosecutor took that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court voted that Nixon had to turn over the tapes. Once he turned over the tapes, it was clear that he had obstructed attempted to cover up the connection between the White House and the Watergate break-in. Whether he had done other things, we're not sure, because 18 minutes on the day when all of this was going down had been erased from the tapes some way.
With a graphic pencil.
But with the tapes, the House Judiciary Committee, that's the committee that does this kind of thing, the committee that Gerald Nadler runs now, who is the guy that will run impeachment if the House decides to impeach President Trump. The Senate Watergate, the House Judiciary Committee drew up 3 articles of impeachment and passed them.
Okay.
And the leadership in the House was going to bring that up the following week, and Nixon resigned in between. So Nixon was never impeached because the House never voted to impeach him. They would have. And in all probability, he would have been convicted because Republicans had decided that, in fact, Nixon had done all of this, and they couldn't get reelected if they supported him. So there was probably a 2/3 in the Senate who would have convicted had an impeachment trial gotten underway.
And it may sound sort of simplistic, although I don't think it is at all. As bad as a chief executive may get in his behavior, his official behavior in office, we don't want to convict anybody. That would cast serious aspersions against our entire political system, governmental system, would be incredibly embarrassing, which is, if you go back to Andrew Johnson's case in the 1860s, one of the things, and we'll, I guess, talk about that, there's fallout. If you impeach, especially the president, try him, convict him, boot him out of office, there are a lot of things you have to consider very carefully before doing that. And one of the things back right after the Civil War that the Congress had to consider very carefully is the man who would have become president of the United States if they'd booted Johnson out of office. It could have been even more trouble. They thought about that, and if you like pretty slimy, back alley, back room, underhanded governmental proceedings, I recommend you read some good stuff on Andrew Johnson's impeachment. They did some very questionable things to ensure that this man was not convicted. And, of course, his case is still the most famous, not simply because it was the first, but he missed being convicted by one vote.
One vote.
So that would have been a further disaster on the heels of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the way it was shaping up. We have a different political climate now, but probably equally as partisan.
Yeah, it appears that way. We're pretty polarized right now. So.
Really?
Yeah. Surprise.
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 And again, all I've been saying to encapsulate is we would rather not do that. That would be a constitutional corner that I don't think anybody who's thought about it seriously really wants to turn.
That's what you're getting from Nancy Pelosi,
Yes.
the Speaker, and the leadership. Don't go down this road. If you do and you fail, it makes it look like you've been persecuting somebody for partisan reasons rather than, passing infrastructure bills, fixing the border, doing taxes, what normal things Congress should be doing. And it could, in her view, turn independents in the country to Mr. Trump, and she thinks they're right now probably not going to vote for him, that they have a chance to throw him out of office in the election in 2020 just because he's never had polling support, public support above about 47%, I believe.
Right.
And he's, he dips down from there.
Well, let's take a break right now. We'll be back, and we're going to start taking a look a little bit more closely at the Trump situation and that word impeachment and how it applies or doesn't apply. We'll be right back right after these important messages. This is Bob Oxley on Tips. Hello, everybody. Bob Oxley back with Tips, and we're going to continue on discussing the topic of impeachment. Again, we have Dr. Chip McLeod and Professor Joe Green here to help us analyze impeachment. And as I mentioned to you, the segment of this week's program, we're going to take a look at impeachment as it pertains to the current president, President Trump. And that word's been used almost on a daily basis, and there's pros and cons. And the Mueller report came out, and we've got Attorney General Barr making comments and giving edited versions of the reports, and all this makes it really hard for the common citizen to get his or her arms around this thing. So, welcome back, gentlemen. Here we go for the segment number 2, and I guess I'm just going to throw it right out there. We've heard obstruction of justice. We've talked about no collusion as a result of the Bob Mueller report that came out. And yet we still are seeing about impeachment. And Professor Green indicated just before the break that Nancy Pelosi, who's the Speaker of the House for the House of Representatives, Democratic side of the House, is saying, no, we don't want impeachment. However, there's other members within the House that are Democratic that are saying, yes, there should be impeachment, including, I think there was a representative from Michigan that joined the bandwagon on that recently. So let me turn it back to you.
He was a Republican. He's the only Republican who was.
Right.
But
right.
he's a strange kind of Republican. He's a libertarian. There's a libertarian in the Congress, and so
yeah, that's near and dear to your heart, isn't it?
Just an homage.
Well, and if you believe that there are other Republicans, of course, they're not talking. They wouldn't dare, I guess. Then there's that. And to make this as complicated as it most certainly is, there are people talking about impeaching Barr and Mnuchin as well. I don't expect that to go anywhere, but they're part of the impeachment conversation. And it is wonderful, enlightening television. I at least alluded to this a little while ago, to catch the president as he exits wherever he's leaving on the White House grounds. And, of course, reporters throng him and ask him all kinds of questions. And he's the one who, so far as I know, began refusing to use the word and calling it the I word. And as I suggested as well, facts of life sometimes are hard to ignore, and a president of the United States who would suggest that somehow the courts could protect him from impeachment per se is a little sad, but nonetheless
ill-informed.
Ill-informed. And so, yes, there are many, many different angles to this whole impeachment consciousness, including the president himself, who has said a few other very curious things. I mean, there is the school of thought, nobody's saying a whole lot about this, where, okay, impeach him, which means you automatically have to be tried on whatever articles of impeachment, in the likelihood, certainly probability, that he would be acquitted. That would certainly make the Democrats look about as bad as ever. We mentioned that. I don't know that he was serious or anybody supporting that approach, how serious those folks might have been, because once again, we don't want anybody to forget that impeachment, if the House goes through with it, it is very, very serious and divisive national business.
Yes.
And
go ahead, Jim.
Jim mentioned we don't know other Republicans in the House who might be willing to vote for it. We also don't know if the Democrats could get a majority of Democrats to vote for it, because in the 2018 election, the Democrats captured a majority by taking over what had been many, traditional Republican districts that have voted Republican for 40 years, especially down in Orange County, California. And those people want to stay as far away from impeachment as they can get, because that could sway their district back. So there's it's the politics of this are really the electoral politics of it are really strange. But there are, I understand, 55 members of the House who are willing to vote for impeachment, even though, again, no articles of impeachment have been drawn up, right. And no one has, Nadler has alluded on one interview that there might be obstruction of justice as a possible charge. He needs to investigate more, he said. But other than that, no one can come up with any high crimes and misdemeanors that you would write into impeachment articles. There seems to be a feeling among those 55 that Trump did something wrong. We don't know what it is yet. We need to investigate. But somehow he's a crook, either before he became president or while he's been president. He's clearly he must have done something wrong. He's such a bad person. So
That's what their conclusion based on. But the evidence, we don't have all the evidence because the report that came out from Bob Mueller, we can't get access to that. They can't get access to
well,
that.
we have other interesting scenarios as well, and whether President Trump is serious about having this move forward because he thinks that the whole process somehow will exonerate him. He's all about that. And B, build even more political support when it makes the Democrats look terrible. There are certainly other things to consider. And one of the components of this is that there's little doubt now, because what Mueller has locked down for us and sort of corroborated and got behind is that you can indict and try a sitting president. Just tossing something out here that's all part of this. We do not know what will happen in the future. I think Donald Trump would like to be president again for a lot of very interesting reasons, one of which may be for the legal protection being president will offer him. My personal / professional opinion is that here we go with all his financials, from
Yes.
tax returns, everything else. I'm relatively convinced that if he were a regular citizen, and we got to look at that after another term, if he's successful, he could be, this is highly speculative, he could be another 80-year-old dude going to jail. But while he's president, he's not.
But that's a Justice Department policy. It's nowhere in the Constitution.
Right.
And so,
But we keep arguing about it, and Mueller just said, okay, here's my authoritative 2 cents worth. You can't indict a sitting president.
And when he came out with that press conference, I didn't understand, what are you doing? And all of a sudden he indicated, look, we didn't draw these conclusions, but it's the responsibility of Congress
Right.
to take some of these questions that we had and pursue those if you deem it necessary. He kind of like left it open, didn't he?
Well, they
Kind of gave him a little direction.
they didn't do what some people wanted him to do, and immediately, it's hard to keep up with the Trumpian interpretations of what's going on. But one of the first things the president had to say was that, oh, this totally exonerates me. And no, it's more complicated than that. But no, it wound up being, in terms of politics, a very unsatisfying outcome for most people, except the people who cleverly tried to spin it, the Republicans and Trump.
And on the other side, I've got listeners that are indicating that the Democrats are trying to spin it when they have no evidence to even pursue this. Is that?
It's a popular political opinion in that political camp, sure.
the claim they make is the wrongdoing Mueller was investigating was Trump campaign colluding with Russia.
Collusion,
Right.
right.
Mueller said no evidence at all that anybody in the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians. The second book, Mueller wrote his report in 2 books. The second book, he investigated where it was his attempt to assess whether the Trump and the Trump campaign had obstructed his investigation. And Mr. Trump clearly thought about firing Mueller and doing other things that Mr. Mueller thought were potential obstruction of justice. But in a criminal court, it's very difficult to convict somebody for thinking when they don't act on it, because Mr. Trump didn't ever fire Mueller. He didn't ever interfere with him. He gave him everything he wanted. So that would be the claim that these listeners that you're talking about would want to make. They would probably go further and say Mr. Mueller, if he was really looking into it, should have looked into the origins of the charge that the campaign. But that is probably something we ought not to take up today.
Yeah, I just think about the millions of hours and time and subpoenas and that went on over a 2-year period, and we're back to where we were. We don't have any. This is my talking. I don't think there's any specific evidence. It's all loosey-goosey stuff.
Mr. Nadler thinks if he can talk to Don McGahn, who was the president's lawyer, and some of the other people around the president, especially who are with him every day in that period.
What was the name of the finance? The guy that's been with them from day one, back when his father was there. He's knows everything there is about the financials of the Trump organization.
Right. He's a banker in New York, and the Southern District of New York prosecutors are dealing with him. That's not part of the obstruction of justice thing. That has to do with whether Mr. Trump's finances are in order and so there's some investigation going on in New York about all of that.
And to some extent, you can watch politics dictate this because, again, while most thinking people are taking this very, very seriously, we don't want any rush to judgment. We don't want to, implement impeachment in some haphazard way because of all the problems we've alluded to that it could certainly cause in many different areas, and the politics behind all of this, unfortunately, I suppose, have always been very precarious. I mean, we have a president to compare. For example, I think of Andrew Jackson, who there just wasn't the overall juice in Congress to go forward with, for example, there was serious talk about impeaching him because if you know a little bit about this era of history, there was something called the Bank War, and what Andrew Jackson fundamentally did was try to get his secretaries of the Treasury, and there were 2 or 3 of them, to take federal funding out of the Bank of the United States and put it in special banks, and he fired a couple because they would not do what he told them to do. And there were lots of people like, well, if this is not impeachable, what is? But he wasn't impeached, for example. So, again, the political environment is although the founders would have preferred this not happen, this is so incredibly political, and people are, whatever they say about Nancy Pelosi, she's certainly the voice of reason when it comes to this very dangerous thing that the House can do.
Yeah. So where do you think this is going to go from here? Based on, you're my experts. We've got the Mueller report. We've got the Attorney General that's giving his interpretation of the information that he's received. And there's a lot. There's 2 sides of the press coming out, giving.
Well, I'm going to toss this out. Big picture. If you want Donald Trump to be successful in the next general election next year, impeach him.
Really?
Yeah, I think. Let's go back to 2016 and even before. Come on, this guy will never garner anybody's nomination. Oops, he can't possibly be elected president. Whoa, wait a minute. It may fire up his base because one of the things that we haven't said is that in the background is this sense among, I'm going to go ahead and suggest it is at least tens of millions of Americans that we have the president that we really want, and you people are trying to scuttle that. And I do not know that impeaching him will not fire up that base and beyond. And if the Democrats have some hope of being successful next year, they certainly ought to think about that.
The housewives, the married women in the suburbs in Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin and Michigan, and what am I leaving out? Were basically decided they went for Trump. Didn't in the polling they said they didn't like him, but when they got in the ballot box they went for him. Okay, and if he's somehow a sympathetic figure, this is exactly what happened to Bill Clinton. He committed indiscretions in the White House and lied to a grand jury about it. But most people didn't think that rose to high crimes and misdemeanors. But, some very rabid Republicans did. They impeached him, and it went absolutely nowhere, and they lost seats in the off-year elections right after that, and Clinton left office with a 60% approval rating.
Which is pretty good.
Really
Yes.
good. If there had not been a 22nd Amendment, Clinton would have run again, and given the really horrible campaign that Al Gore ran against George W. Bush and still got more popular votes, Clinton probably would have won a third term.
Wow.
And impeachment, the sense that they attacked the guy that we voted in. A bunch of elites think they can replace what the voters want. Played a huge role in those events in 1998, 1999, and the election of 2000.
Here's something interesting then, based on what you just said about Clinton and what we talked about previously about Nixon. The president doesn't have to remove himself from office because he's impeached. Does that mean he's removed from office? Is that being impeached?
No.
See, there's a misnomer about that.
Well, we sort of covered that in the first segment, but to reiterate very quickly, impeachment is purely and solely the House of Representatives voting. All you need is a bare majority. That's all you need, just a simple majority. You have written an article of impeachment. Here it is. Whatever it says, that's moot right now. When you get in the current House of Representatives, 218 votes are required. When those 218 members of the House go, we are going to level this article of impeachment against you. You have been impeached. There's nothing else to impeachment.
It's like if someone charges me with robbing a bank.
Right.
They bring charges, but then there has to be a trial to see if
Again,
I'm guilty.
The language is in the Constitution. It is the task of the United States Senate to try impeachments.
Got it.
That's different. That's not impeachment. That's trying some article of impeachment.
So Clinton was impeached, and the trial went on for 2 weeks. I was glued to my TV. Many people my age were. And in the end, they couldn't even get 50 votes for either, let alone 67 for either of the articles of impeachment that the House had drawn up.
So if we look at current President Trump, and let's say that the House changes their mind, something comes up, whatever, and they impeach President Trump, but he still has the majority in the Senate.
Well, the thing is, first of all,
likelihood of him coming to trial is almost nil.
no, he'll go to trial.
He'll go to trial.
But he
There'll
won't
be a
be
trial.
he won't be convicted.
Yeah.
And I am certainly eager, if they go that far, to see what the only ones required, or articles of impeachment would look like. And the one thing we haven't talked about is that there seems to be a Democrat or 2 or 3 or 27 or whatever we're talking about who all think that impeachment will be the road to further revelations about what Trump is up to here and there, give them further license to investigate stuff that they haven't been able to investigate thus far. But the end game, if you're thinking that way, I don't know that will get them much, if anything. But the end game, as we're both saying, is that in order to be convicted, the senators, they're the people who try you. You must have a 2/3 majority, and I don't know where they're going to get 2/3 of the U.S. Senate to vote to convict Donald Trump.
Especially when 54 of the senators, 54 of the 100, are Republicans who have every political reason not to vote guilty.
Right, and if they put him through that, once again, I think it's going to energize the people who support him, because now he'll be a little mini Donald Trump martyr almost, and it's going to help him if they do that.
So he's going to be reelected.
Well, maybe.
Republicans are just licking their chops.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Make my day.
right. Impeach him.
Thank you, Clint. Yeah, this is great. This is exactly what I wanted to hear from you. And I have to, based on just our discussions here, I have to go along with that. I think that if the Democrats, even though it's not supposed to be political, pursue this impeachment, that it is going to act as a catalyst for re-election of President Trump.
Well, we talking about American politics and rationality. It's two separate volumes, two separate books. But I have no problem telling anybody listening or anybody understand. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump's, but just because I don't particularly care for the guy, that's not an impeachable offense. They can't do that. That's wrong. That's very dangerous.
And Dr. Green, or Professor Green, what do you think? Do you feel the same way?
Here's what I would predict, though. It looks to me, based on the discussions that are going on behind closed doors that we just get a peek at, that Mr. Nadler, who is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, would like to start an impeachment inquiry. It doesn't mean that in the end they would vote articles of impeachment in their committee and send them to the floor for the whole House to vote on. I sincerely doubt if he did that they would even get the House to vote for it. But he can start, if he starts an impeachment inquiry, he can start calling witnesses, and then, but Mr. Trump won't send any witnesses up. He'll claim executive privilege.
Right.
And then Mr. Nadler, as they're currently doing, will go to court, and ultimately court proceedings will determine whether this person or that person has to comply with, turning over Trump's tax returns, or whether Mr. McGahn has to come up and testify, and whether Mr. Mueller has to come in and testify. He says he won't. But all of that's going to take more than 2 years.
Yes.
After which we're going to have the election anyway.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, I hate to say this to you, but guess what? Time is up.
All right.
I really appreciate it. We really have investigated impeachment. I'm sure that our listeners really enjoyed this, because we started off with just the basics, and we evolved through a couple of the presidential impeachments in history, and ended up with talking about the situation with Donald Trump and the impeachment process, or potential process, or maybe not at all right now. I just want to thank you again for taking time and coming in and giving your expertise on this most interesting topic, and one that affects all of the American people. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes Tips for this week. Topics, issues, and positions on KDXI 100.3. You can listen to our broadcast at 3 o'clock on Fridays and rebroadcast it on Saturdays at 5 p.m. Also, we're on Facebook, Twitter, Alexis. You can ask Alexis for Radio St. George and ask for tips, and specifically in this case would ask for impeachment, and that will bring that up for you there. We're on podcast on Podbean affiliate, so you can get a hold of us at any time, 24 hours, 7 days a week, and we're listening for next week. I'm not going to give you what the topic is, but it's going to be interesting, trust me. Thank you again, Dr. Chip McLeod, Professor Joe Green from Dixie State University, and we'll hopefully hear from you during the week, and I'll be back with you online next Friday at 3 o'clock. Bye-bye.